Let's talk about Islam, which is a religion that is accused by some to be violent by nature and to be totalitarian. For example, people like Jordan Peterson accuse Islam to be at odds with Western values.
Part of the bedrock of our culture is the idea of the separation between church and state. And as far as I can tell, that idea doesn't exist in the Muslim world. And so I cannot understand how that faith is commensurate with the institutions of the West.
There's a number of things we need to sort of point out to unpack what Jordan Peterson is saying. I think in simple terms he's guilty of very simplistic and very reductionist understanding and takes a very judgmental approach, if not a bigoted approach. Almost 1/4 of humanity at this point in history identifies as being Muslim. It's very, very diverse population of almost 2 billion people. Every kind of variation you can imagine. People who identify as Christian, whether Catholic or Orthodox or Protestant or whatever, represent a slightly larger section of humanity, but these are two broadly large groups of humanity. And if you think about those who identify as Christian, there's endless diversity and expression. A pro-Trump white evangelical in Alabama is not the same as a Franciscan brother or sister in Chile, right? It's or working in Ghana, or Orthodox believer in Russia. There's great variation in Christianity. So too with Islam. Now, one thing we do need to recognize is that there are 50 nation states. Most of these nation states only emerging in the mid-20th century, shaking off a long struggle with colonialism and other forms of oppression. The 50 nation states in which the majority of citizens identify as Muslim. So 50 Muslim nations, not Islamic nations, but Muslim nations in terms of the demographics. So that's 1/4 of the world, 1/4 of the world's nations belong to what you might call in that sense the Muslim world or the Muslim majority world. And of those 50 nation states, only a handful are healthy, functioning democracies. Countries like Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim majority state by the way, or Tunisia, which is much smaller, but it's, like Indonesia, is distinguished by having successfully made a transition to democracy. An incomplete transition, an imperfect transition, but they have both transitioned on the path to democracy. Countries like Bangladesh or Pakistan have much more mixed results. They have some aspects of democracy, but it's held back by other competing factors, and often sort of populist sentiment on the street gets in the way of democratic process, and of course the presence of the military. Another large Muslim population is in India. Of course it's a minority population, but it's almost the same size as that in Bangladesh and Pakistan, just a little bit smaller than that in Indonesia. And it struggles with persecution and prejudice itself, but also within the community. Indian democracy is a very imperfect thing. If you go to North Africa or to the Arabian Peninsula, you find a lot of authoritarian states. Some have aspects of democracy, or some regular elections. Tunisia is the best example. Others are failing states like Libya, or very authoritarian states like Egypt. And of course in the Arabian Peninsula you find the same pattern. And then across Central Asia and West Asia, Afghanistan's just had an election, but there's a very high level of fraudulent voting, it would seem, of rigging of polls, and of course a lot of intimidation, so the voter turnout was very low. So when you look at those sort of present patterns, you'd say there's a problem with the Muslim world. And it's understandable if people simplistically say, well, there's obviously a problem with Islam, because what's the common identity? These people are all Muslims, they all identify with Islam. But that's much too simplistic. Just like we couldn't have looked at the people of Latin America a couple of decades ago and said, well, they're all Catholics and they speak Spanish, or at least they speak Spanish or Portuguese, a Latin language. That's the problem. Well, no, it's not. It's to do with historical context. It's to do with the ending of the Cold War, the ending of colonialism. The same thing is true of the Muslim world or the Muslim majority countries. It is a reality, though, that at the time these countries were being born, that they got independence, we had contesting ideas for pan-Arab nationalism or other kinds of broader nationalism, of socialism, of more distinctive nationalisms. And in that context, what we now know as Islamism emerged out of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and spreading to other Arab states. and then picked up in Asia with other so-called Al-Ikhwan al-Muslim in the Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwani movements such as PAS in Malaysia or PKS in Indonesia, and mixed often with the ideas of Indian thinkers such as Maududi and ideas out of the Deobandi school, which is the ideas that have informed the Pakistan and Afghan Taliban. That's all something that emerged in the middle of the 20th century. It became more intensely felt in the late 20th century, and in this 21st century, these last 2 decades, this kind of Islamist politics has had a very shrill voice. Now, one of the perverse ironies of people like Jordan Peterson, who, you know, for whatever his erudition and scholarship, is not strong when it comes to religion and Islam particularly, one of the things that they miss is that when they quote this unquestioned statement that Islam doesn't separate church and state, that there is no separation of politics and religion in Islam, they're quoting Islamist politics. Now, if you want to criticize Islamist politics, that's entirely legitimate, but understand that Islamist politics represents a small minority of political views in the Muslim world. It's a dominant, shrill voice, and understand that Islamist politics also, to the extent that there is free and fair voting, even in constricted cases such as Pakistan, the Islamist parties do very, very badly. Typically, in most national settings, Islamist parties struggle to get beyond 10% of the national vote. And I think that needs to be understood in the context of far-right populist parties around the world. So Marine Le Pen's far-right movement in France struggles to get beyond 10%. The Islamist League in Pakistan similarly, and that speaks to me of a broader problem. It is true if radical Islamist politics was the dominant popular idea, if most people voting in polls said this is our politics, yeah, we'd have a much bigger problem. But the reality is that this 1/4 of humanity, 1.9, almost 2 billion people, are not persuaded by an argument that says let's give power to officials, to politicians, who can then preside over moral policing and tell us how to pray, how to eat, how to marry, how to live, how to run our families. Most Muslims say we don't want that, which is very familiar. I mean, who does want somebody, a political figure, telling us how to live our lives in terms of our religious convictions? So if the phenomenon Jordan Peterson was describing was a majority phenomenon, he may have a point, but he's latched on to a minority group with extreme ideas and then conflated them with the entirety of sort of the greater Muslim population. He's made the same mistake, incidentally, as Samuel Huntington. Now, whether he made it in good faith or in bad faith, I can't be sure, but there are some hallmark sort of levels of self-righteous judgmentalism which suggest there's a degree of bad faith involved in this.